how about the term Mexican American? So a little bit more modern. So this was an attempt around World War II for Mexicans born in America to embrace both countries, both cultures, and not necessarily to shed either or, but to embrace that they were part of different cultures and various countries. So Mexican American in some way can embrace both. I'll be honest, there's a lot of deeper meaning and histories to these, and we'll get back to some of these, but I wanted to briefly bring this up. And so if you look here at number 3, the Mexican American, what's key is the hyphen in the middle. Other Chicano or old school Mexican American scholars talked about embracing this in-between identity. But this Mexican American identity is also critiqued later on by those that call themselves Chicanos or Chicanas, and we'll get to that in a moment. Chicano, brown is beautiful. So we're gonna see the popularization and the embrace of the term Chicano by the 1960s, going into the 1970s and beyond. But historically, during the Chicano movement in the United States, this is a politicized term that comes with radical connotations of who Mexicans are in the United States. Chicano was to embrace your brownness, and that it was beautiful, and that there was no shame in being brown. There was no shame in who you were in America, and you did not have to claim a Spanish fantasy heritage if that was not the case for you. And so you're going to see a lot of these slogans during this time, during the Chicano movement. Brown is beautiful, very similar to the calls from Black Power, Black is beautiful, again during the civil rights of the 1960s and 1970s. So the term Chicano is derived from the community, from the people, from the activists, from the people fighting for their rights within the United States, and not necessarily a governmental term. So this is what should stand out to you as a unique term, is that Chicano is actually not classified, let's say, or has origins from the government, but rather from activists, from artists, from families and community members. And again, there's some other deeper history where how did that term come from? Was it Chicano? Is the origin Mexicano? But we'll focus here on Chicano from the Chicano movement, okay? And again, the term Chicano signifies and is going to exemplify pride in Mexican culture, and very specifically from our native, our indigenous Mesoamerican roots in the Americas. And again, a call to move away from whiteness per se, but to embrace and be proud of our native heritage, and not to have that shame in America that we could still be Mexican, but we were always native. And so Chicano, remember, it comes with that politicized connotation. So I've asked you earlier to think about significance. These terms are not just flat and neutral, they have history, they have context. And again, very specifically, Chicanos embraced during the height of the Chicano movement. So we have a backdrop for that. It also meant politically aware, socially conscious. If you were Chicano, you were, in today's time, what young folks may say, you were quote unquote woke. You had social awareness, you had social politics, you were invested in social justice. So again, this very keen awareness of your own history, your culture, and politics in social justice. So a lot of times, and I often get asked this in my classes, Professor, is Chicano kind of the same thing as Mexican American? Because I don't know the difference, and it kind of seems the same. So in the modern context, a lot of times people will confuse Chicano with, oh, maybe they think it means Mexican American or some kind of watered down Mexican in the United States. So a lot of times people consider it Mexican American. So it becomes synonymous with the term Mexican American, but that is not the case. Chicano does not necessarily mean Mexican American, not within this historical context, because once you water down the term Chicano, it's going to lose its political edge and simply just mean Mexican American. So remember that this is a highly politicized term. It has radical leanings of self-determination, of Native pride, community building. And I am saying that the O because that's historically correct. And I'll get into some other versions of Chicano a little bit later. Hispanic. This is a popular one. I have a lot of students that identify as Hispanic and other terms listed here, but let's check out Hispanic. So Hispanic is going to be tied to Spain and Spanish. And let me explain that here in a moment. So we saw the term Hispanic really kind of generate itself. This is the government word of choice for people of Spanish origin. And then a term that made its way on the US Census in the 1980s or in 1980. So again, if you're legitimately from Spain, then this is a good term for you. It has a Spanish origin. And within the American context, it became more readily visible on the US Census in the 1980s. But this was coined under the Nixon administration in the 1970s. And this was an attempt to link Spanish-speaking peoples to Spain. So stay with me for a moment because I know this can be confusing. But remember, all these terms have historical context and they have political meanings. So Hispanic then becomes popularized around this time. So if you speak Spanish, then you're linked to Spain. It doesn't necessarily mean that you are legitimately from Spain, but if you speak Spanish, and this gets complicated with the history of colonization in the Americas. So I advise you to take our other Chicano studies classes that go deep into colonialism and colonization. We teach Chicano Studies 101, and we go into great depth into that. I know I do, and the other professors. So just an FYI. So let's look here at number 3. The term Hispanic was attempting to indicate countries colonized by Spain. So the name a few would be Mexico, Latino America, Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Caribbean. So if you were colonized by Spain through rule, the Spanish conquest, through forms of domination, these types of things that we go deeper into in Chicano Studies 101, it didn't mean that you were from Spain though. So once we understand the history of colonization, this is how the Spanish language comes to the Americas, comes to Mexico, comes to Latin America, is through violence and through the forced imposition of speaking Spanish on the indigenous people, okay? So again, remember that it's tied to colonization, but if you're legitimately from Spain, that this is a good term. So hopefully that makes some sense. So let's check out another term that becomes really popular, and I hear it all the time. Oh, and just real quick, let's see, Hispanic is more conservative than the term Chicano. Before I move forward, let me just make a quick point on this. So even within the terms and different camps and different activists and different scholars, typically the term Hispanic is associated with more quote unquote conservative people or people that align themselves with, let's say, a more white heritage. It doesn't mean all the time, but these are some of the political debates, even within the terms and within the field. And Chicano is seen as more radical. And, you know, people critique the term Chicano a lot. And then some other scholars also critique the term Hispanic. So people tend to think of Hispanic as more conservative. So let's look at Latino. I was jumping ahead here. So by the 1980s, Latino becomes popularized. And I know there are some deep roots in terms of the casta system with the Spanish and colonial Mexico. But you, again, as I mentioned earlier, depending on the time period, how do terms change and move depending on history, depending on war, depending on political power, okay? So by the 1990s, this term is becoming more popular. No surprise, if you're looking at the timeline I've set out for you, it comes later than Chicano to pacify the term because it had radical and activist meaning more than Hispanic and Latino. So again, I just mentioned this here briefly, is that because these terms have such deep meaning and context, Latino became more palatable, if you will, or Hispanic became more embraced because some people did not want to be identified as Chicano or as activists or as community oriented or claiming Native roots and ancestry. So in many ways, this is where you can see, what are the difference of these terms and what do they mean historically and politically, okay? So if I have any 90s kids in the cyber classroom, let it be known. I wish you were alive and you can chat me. But no, for real, let's think about it. If you grew up in the 90s, you know that this was a time that was really important to Latinidad, Latino identity. This is what was called the Latino boom or the Latino explosion. I'm not sure if that's a good connotation, but boom, Latinos were kind of on the scene in the mainstream. You had the rise of Selena. She was doing her crossover album. You had, let's see, Ricky Martin was really popular at the time. Latina Cuban talk show host, Esta Cristina, was kind of what a lot of Latinos had called the Oprah Winfrey for the Latinos talk show host. The rise of Jennifer Lopez. So you did see a lot of Latinos busting on the mainstream. In terms of entertainment, I would say, and it was really cool because usually we would only see in mainstream entertainment black or white. So back to the black or white binary, and that's a whole nother lecture and a whole nother topic. So we began to see a little bit more of Latinos on this quote Latino boom. We also have the rise of Mexican or Latino supermarkets that became more visible and more popular in the 1990s. So just to name a couple of things there and a couple of artists, and I'm sure you remember or you can search the internet. Okay, let's go. What else do we got? So Latino is a vague umbrella term. It's a generic descriptor of such a diverse group of people. So there's not one type of Latino. This is why a lot of people also get confused because there's so much diversity and difference within the group that we call Latino. And it also gets very political, okay? So Latino attempts to indicate people from Latin America, not just from Spain or due to Spanish colonization or tied to language, but more so tied to national origin. So for example, Brazilians would not be considered Hispanic. Tell me why. Pause the video. Tell me real quick, what do you think? They wouldn't be considered Hispanic because Brazil was not colonized by Spain and therefore they do not speak Spanish. What language do they speak? So they wouldn't fit under the Hispanic label, okay? So that's just one example to hopefully help you tease it out a little bit more. So a lot of different people could fit into this category. So there's one example there. So gender and sexuality when thinking about these terms, let's get into it because it's not just race. All racialized labels are gendered and sexualized, and we're going to look at that here in a moment. They're going to indicate these other things as well, right? So these terms are gendered. They exclude women, right? The term Chicano, the term Latino. So when I say Chicano in a historical context from the Chicano movement, everybody's so quick to be politically correct and everybody wants to be like, oh, the most woke. But no, historically, that is accurate to say Chicano and study the origins. and say the Chicano movement. It was not called the Chicano movement. It was not called the Chicanx movement, right? So in many ways, it also points to some of the issues and problems even within communities of color, dealing with issues beyond race. So you'll see the Chicano movement in many ways was problematic. It had issues of sexism and homophobia. Even the term Latino, right? When students or have Spanish speaking students, we notice that if there's only one student or one woman in a group of men, and let's say there's 10 men, that group would be referenced as Latinos, because women are not acknowledged as much as men within the culture. So this is, again, you see the gender issues and things like that. And don't get me confused. In American language, we do the same thing. And now we're seeing more moves for more inclusivity, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But when we say, hi guys, right, that's a reference to just always acknowledging boys or men. You wouldn't walk up to a group of both men and women and say, hi girls, unless you were joking, right? But to do that in a group with both men and women and other people that identify in different genders, that could be considered offensive. So, because again, what's being honored? Patriarchal order, men, boys over women and girls, okay? So one thing to think about in terms of gender and sexuality, and not just terms, but language and power, and this is what we're deciphering here. So today, people are more inclusive of representing women and sexual identity, and they'll use a variety of terms, especially if you're on social media a lot or a little bit more younger generation. You're going to see a variety of terms, and let me bring that up here. So let's look here at this first one. I have Chicano/A. That was, again, really popular in the 90s. A lot of Chicana activists, scholars, community folks really did fight to get the A, because they did see the Chicano as excluding the efforts of Chicana activists, artists, writers, students, community members. And so that was really, really critical. I went to school at UC Santa Barbara in the Department of Chicano Studies. But by the time that I graduated, we had done some activism there around adding the /A in the department. So even more modern times, right? We can see that. And then even now there would be a critique of Latino with the O, right? And you can see that again with Latino /. So that's where the slashes come from, to think about gender inclusivity. And today, and another way that I would see it a lot would be the @ at the end of Chicano to kind of encompass both genders. Some people don't like that, may be considered out of date. And here I have Chicanx with the big X, just for reference, you can see it. So a lot of times, and this is very now too, where people are doing the X. So this is to hopefully be more gender inclusive, can indicate sexuality, and also any gender that's just not male or female. So the X in many ways can be intersectional identities, trans identity. So some people like the X, some people are confused by the X. So here we have another term. This one looks crazy. I'm sorry I did this. So sometimes you would see Chicano with an X to exemplify our indigenous roots. And again, the @ to incorporate both genders, or you could put another X there. And then we're also seeing really now very, very 2020, Latinx. And so again, we're thinking about gender, race, sexuality, and for communities of color, Black folk, indigenous people, people of color in general, you know, we cannot separate race from our gender, from sexuality. They're always working together, and they're always in this kind of intersectional identities. So therefore, the terms can be complicated and confusing. So a little bit of gender and sexuality when thinking about these terms. And finally, let's look at this image together. I'm going to go ahead and read this just in case you're not able to check it out. But so here we go. Let's start with this. Latino is a term that is telling you about geography. Hispanic is a term that is telling you about language. It's easy to remember if you dissect the words. Latino means from Latin America. Latin America refers mostly to everything below the United States of America, including the Caribbean. Hispanic means from a country whose primary language is Spanish, but not every country in Latin America speaks primarily Spanish. Right, okay, so I thought this might help condense some of the things I'm talking about, and I thought it was a really good way to really think about Latino and Hispanic. Okay, and you can stop the slide and check it out. So finally, this is too much to cover in one lecture. So of course, there'll be a part 2 or part 3 or some more parts, okay, bear with me. So to be continued. So other terms to be discussed at another time in another lecture would be Chicana, the term white, Latin, Indian, indigenous, and native. So hang tight for that one. I know you're excited and you want to know. But in the meantime, please review your self-reflection posed at the beginning of the lecture. What did you learn? What was surprising to you? And do you still identify with certain terms? Maybe you now like another term. I don't know. A lot of my students tend to do that, okay? Anyways, that's it for me. I know it was a lot. You can pause the slides. You can do some more research. But I'm really excited to share this information with you. These are very common questions I get as a Chicana studies professor. What does Latino mean? What is Hispanic? What's Chicano? And I'm like, okay, we gotta go deep. So anyways, thank you for learning. I love you for learning, and I'll see you in cyberspace.